Hello, everyone. It is time for a NiCHE Conversation, Halloween edition. We're talking about witchcraft today, and we're talking about it in relation to colonialism. So, Adrian is already here, so I'm going to invite them in. Let's see here. There we go.
Hello.
Hello.
So
Welcome.
nice to meet you.
Welcome to NiCHE Conversations. I am Jessica DeWitt, one of the editors here at the Network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am joined by Adrian Deveau. Do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Yeah, so it's nice to see everyone. Hello, my name is Adrian Deveau. I am completing my PhD, fingers crossed, at Concordia University right now in the Department of Art History. And yeah, so my main research is on queer performance in settler Canada. So this was really like a special project for me to undertake here through Ghostlight. And I see Carolyn's here. It's so nice to see you. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about something that is outside of my dissertation.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, right now we are currently ongoing series Ghostlight 2 Monstrosities, which is edited by our editor Caroline Abbott. And for this, you published a piece called Consultation with the Devil, Witchcraft and Stolen Land in the Quebecois Colonial Imaginary. And that's where we're going to be talking about today. And I thought we would start off kind of by talking about the place. So, where is the Ile de Laine? I can't talk. 2 years of French Duolingo. Ile de Laine. And what are the tales of witchcraft associated with this place?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, Ile de Laine is an island running parallel from Quebec City here in Quebec, situated in the St. Lawrence River. So you have the St. Lawrence River striding the land, and Ile de Laine is this sliver, right, in this river. And it was known, and is still known today, as the gemstone or the garden of Quebec. It is this beautiful expanding landscape with overlooking mountains, with lots of farmland, lots of vegetation. And Quebec held this like a precious gem. They really loved having this space. But Ile de Laine also holds kind of more sinister histories, right? On the surface, we have this gleaming waters, but underneath, it's quite a traumatic history beneath this aesthetic. And the island was originally, it has many, many names, but in terms of settler colonialism, it was nicknamed Ile Sorcière. So the witchcraft island, or the witch's island. And I was really interested in this space. I'd been going to the island since I was a teenager, going out and visiting this island, and I had just gone again this past spring. And I had heard this story from a tour guide who said, well, this is the witch's island, right? This is an island of witchcraft. There's histories of ghosts, histories of devil worship here. And I was like, you look around on the island and there's almost virtually no signs of it left, right? There's no hints to there being witches there. And I was told of this story, La Corriveau, on this island, right? And La Corriveau is this Quebecois folktale, very tied to the history of the island, of this woman who is a witch, who came back from the dead. She had been put in this metal cage, head to toe, and she would haunt the visitors of the island, particularly, and she would follow them on Halloween Eve, right? So, this is a very prominent energy, and this island is really rooted in these folktales. There's stories of ghost lights, there's stories of, like I said, devil worship, and I'll talk more about this in a bit. And when missionaries first came to the island, they had, particularly one missionary, Reverend Father Charlevoix. He was a so-called historian of Quebecois culture. He had written that when he came here, there were stories of devil worship. And this was in the primary document that I'd found in the Bibliothèque Nationale de Quebec here, that when you came here, there were stories of premonitions, that the individuals on the island could foresee the future, that they were practicing devil worship, and that they were practicing witchcraft. And I was like, well, this is what I had heard in person. What's going on in this, right? And also with this island, these folk tales were passed down to children's stories as well, right? So this island is really both a powerful tool in settler colonialism, which we can chat about, and also in the Quebecois imaginary, that this is a mystical island.
Yeah, I love this example of this one place, and I think a lot of us grew up in places that have similar tales of some, like I certainly did. I grew up in a very rural area, but the cemetery in my village of 24 people was haunted. And I think a lot of us we have these stories that are just continuously passed down from generation to generation, and they're significant in many ways. But one of them is their connection to colonialism. So I thought maybe you could describe that further, like how are tales of witchcraft connected to colonialism?
Yeah, I'd be happy to chat about this. I mean, there's multiple layers here, particularly in this example. And one book that really inspired me to look further into this was Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch. And in this, and Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation. And in this book, Silvia Federici, a very prominent Marxist feminist out of Italy, had taken the example of the witch trials of Europe and looked at the structural underpinnings and economic conditions in which these witch trials emerged. And they emerged alongside the privatization of the commons, right? So the commons were this land in which the working class, the so-called peasantry, could cultivate land for their own without it being commodified or sold. And these commons were privatized with the expansion of the bourgeoisie and the transformation of the mercantile class into the bourgeoisie. Yeah. And these witch trials, accusations of witchcraft, happened at the same time as this expansion of this colonial power. And a lot of these women, predominantly women, were older women, were women who didn't have children, were not married. It could be, there were some cases, particularly in Salem, of men, of these men who maybe rise to power or might be farmers, and individuals want their land, right? So they're now a witch. And these individuals were persecuted because of it. And I was really interested in the figure of La Corriveau in relation to the figure of this witch as this undisciplined body, right? This figure that could not be controlled by the settler state, therefore was labeled as a witch, as someone who is casting spells and is very vengeful. And in the case of La Corriveau, there's a lot of work being done on her figure now about how La Corriveau was actually a victim of domestic violence, and she had killed her husband to escape domestic violence. That she wasn't tried for witchcraft, she was tried for murder, but this whole spectacle became of her that she was actually put in a cage, very violently, and hanged. So she was murdered for this, and then her tale of witchcraft emerged. And I was really interested in how femininity and challenges to the patriarchy under the settler colonial power, even by settlers, sparked these ideas of witchcraft. Yeah. And so I went on this long kind of exploration of this. But even beneath this is like something that kind of blew my mind, that was so fascinating. The Huron-Wendat Nation, who have long ties before settlers emerged and came to Ile de Lion, they had quite a dense oral history of the island. And for Huron-Wendat peoples, on Ile de Lion, they originally named the island Minigo, which meant a bewitched island. And for Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, they had named the island the Wendigo. And if you're familiar with the Wendigo is this figure in Anishinaabe, oral histories of this man who was transformed into to this higher being who would eat people. And in the case of Anishinaabe folklore and analogy, it was a case of settler colonialism of the Wendigo eating settlers. So when Charlevoix first came to the island, after these indigenous oral histories and ancestors like the Minigo were already on the island, when they're talking about devil worship, when they're talking about witchcraft, when they're talking about premonition, we can see the direct tie of indigenous oral histories and permeating this kind of Christian consciousness of devil worship, right? Indigenous now devil worship. So I was really interested in this tie. And at the time when La Corriveau was persecuted, this 90% of Huron-Wendat peoples actually had been killed on this genocide of disease brought by colonizers. So there is this haunting, this spectral haunting of indigenous life, indigenous ancestors with the Minigo and the Wendigo, permeating the consciousness of these colonizers, right? Who read devil worship into the undisciplined individuals in their newly formed missionary colony. So it's very a very complex and bizarrely case.
It's fascinating. There's so many different threads coming in, and it's a great example, and it's also an example of how these colonial and these gendered ideas, etc., have permeated very vast stretches of the world, right? And we can connect all of these different stories together, and they often have similar tie-ins, and it's just absolutely fascinating. So at NiCHE, we always come back to the environment, right? So what do these witch tales have to tell us about Quebec's environmental history?
What's really interesting is, before I kind of answered this question, I had gone back to Ile d'Orléans in April after kind of having this idea. And I went around the island. There were these beautiful, jam factories, all of these churches. But one thing, maybe my answer is there's not an answer, in the fact that the island is still established as this pristine gem or garden. I searched extensively for signs of both Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, and cultures and people in some sort of markers or in some sort of archive. The same with La Corriveau. And what this tells us about environmental histories is that Quebec's nationalism is very specific, right? Their nationalism is in the preservation of this fantasy, or this idea that Quebec is this land, this pristine land that is without this violence, right? Because often Quebecois nationalism is, they see themselves as the first settlers, right? Indigenous culture is kind of washed away, right? They were Quebecois. Often a lot of Quebecois nationalists will say that they were peaceful with Indigenous people, and a lot of these violences were washed. So I think something about environmental histories was, well, one, it can tell us about, how the land had transformed during, let's say, the 7 Years' War. During the 7 Years' War, Ile d'Orléans was essentially taken over by British soldiers, by British military, as a kind of a St. Lawrence River for trade, right? And when you read a lot of these histories, these multiple layers of devil worship, Indigenous sovereignty, into the occupation of British military on an already colonized island by French settlers, who then, were colonizing indigenous communities, we see that the environmental history of Ile d'Orléans is incredibly tied to these invisible structures, right? We have this land that is this beautiful farmland, but the traces of these lands are preserved by a colonial power that we can't see, right? We can see it through these old kind of beautiful churches on the island. We can see it through the striated farmlands, but it is a key example of the longing of a history. You know, we can see this across you know, a lot of fascist ideologies. I'm not saying, like, in this case, like, I'm not saying the Quebec government is fascist, even though
another time
longer conversation. But yeah, we can see these histories obfuscated by the land, right? I would say that about environmental history. And one thing, you know, especially going around and looking at this is, you know, I can see a thread through Ghostlight, through all of these papers, is looking at these monstrous figures and how they're speaking for these violent histories of the land, right? These are a way of talking about it. By looking at the witch, by looking at devil worship, by looking at, you know, these demonic figures, it's a way of giving voice to the violences of the land that have been disappeared, that have been, you know, paved over, that have been grown over, farmed over. Environmental history in this case is, you know, how do we re-engage with the land through these stories? If these stories are not visible on the land, how do oral histories, you know, striate this land to kind of bring back history into a living moment? Yeah.
I love that. That makes a lot of sense to me, and it's making me think of, you know, how we use, like, I'm a park historian, so it's a similar thing where we are using the land as a way to hide certain stories and to kind of distract from certain stories when we have these pretty pieces of land, or these pieces of land that we've saved. And despite the fact that they are in them very selves a continuation of these violent forces, right? So anyways, that's what your ideas are bringing me to. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and yeah, thanks for writing about it and sharing. And I think everyone should check this out. They should check out Ghostlight in its entirety. And also Caroline's article from a couple years ago about Hell Hollow Road is about a ghost as well. And I think it has some similar tie-ins to environmental history and gender and stuff. So I'm going to post those to our story.
Fantastic.
And thank you, Adrian, for joining me today. This was fantastic.
Thank you so much, and I wish you all a happy Samhain, a happy Halloween, and give these ghosts a nice big hug because they deserve it.
Indeed. Okay. Take care.
Thank you so much.